Hello? How's everybody doing? I'll have to admit that when Adam sent me an email and said the information that he sent me, I was reading the information and going, why is he sending me this? Because this is somebody that I've known for 45 years. And then I went back and reread again, and it said, would you introduce this person? Well, the reason why I know the speaker for 45 years is the fact that 44 years in July, I married a girl by the name of Carol Darety. And our speaker tonight is Paul Darety. So he is Carol's brother. I want to read what has been submitted, but I might have to add a couple of things there. Paul was born in Humboldt, Tennessee, to Raymond and Betty Darety. He was raised or grew up in Milan, graduated from Milan High School. He has a BA and a Master's in Ministry from Freed-Hardeman University. I will have to say that Carol's dad and Paul's dad served as an elder at Main Street Church of Christ for many, many years. He has worked for congregations in Mayfield, Kentucky, Tresvant, Bradford, Waverly, and Dixon. He currently is the minister for the River Road Church of Christ in Nashville. Paul married his high school sweetheart, Suzanne, who is with us tonight, Suzanne DePriest. They have one son, Ethan, and he didn't add this, but I'm going to add it. Ethan is a CPA, worked for several years or a few years in the private sector, and he now is the business analyst for Freed-Hardeman University. But I think one of their greatest treasures is a little girl named Grayson. It's their granddaughter. She's 3 now, is that right? Make sure that's correct. Ethan is married to Carrie Gott, who is also Freed-Hardeman people too. But anyway, but Grayson is the treasure of their family. And we're so glad to have them with us tonight. So, without any other funny stories or strange things, here's Paul Darety.
I'm glad he read it as it was written. I was afraid, let me just back up just a little bit. Monday morning, I don't know how you are, but Monday mornings when I get up and begin to get ready, I'm running through my head. I do this every morning anyway, but on Monday mornings, I'm running through my head. What's going to happen? What's the day going to be like? Who am I going to see? Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? And I do that on Mondays for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and even sometimes on Saturday. And so I was very excited about coming, very excited, been for a long time. Adam, when he got a hold of me, appreciate him and appreciate the elders for the invitation to be with you. But I was sitting Monday, and I was sitting at the table, I was eating my breakfast, breakfast of champions, cornflakes. And as I was eating them, I got this text, and it said, guess who's introducing you Wednesday night? And I said, I don't want to go. Can I stay home? But no, I appreciate Vernon, love Vernon dearly. My sister couldn't have brought home a better brother-in-law, and I appreciate that, and appreciate and love my sister. We are close, and we won't tell you who's older, but I used to be called her little brother till I got to looking old, and then all of a sudden I became her brother. And so that might tell you a little bit about where we are. I've been asked to talk on the subject of staying rooted, what to do when government tells you basically no to your faith. Well, let me tell you, we're going to hold true to that subject, but probably not the way you're thinking, and not the way in a political way. Because I received, when I was a young fellow, matter of fact, I'll tell you, it came from mine and Carol's dad. I was a student at Freed-Hardeman fixing to graduate and get out into the preaching world, and Dad said, son, there are 3 things that when you talk about them will make people mad. And I said, okay, what are they? He says, well, first of all, you begin to talk to people about their religion, they're going to get mad. I said, okay, that's great. He said, the second thing is that if you talk to them about money, they're going to be mad. And I said, okay. And he said, the third thing, if you talk to them about politics, they're going to get mad. He said, now you're a preacher. You're going to have to talk to them about their religion, and you're going to have to talk to them about giving every once in a while, so you're going to talk about money. And he said, you just stick to those two subjects. You preach the truth. And he said, don't talk about politics. So I don't talk about politics. But I want you to think about the world in which we live for just a minute. I want you to think about the fact that we live in a world of rules. We all have rules. From beginning to end of life, we have rules. When we were babies born, our parents thought that we had to be put to bed at a certain time and we had to be awakened at a certain time. And then as we got older and we eventually got out into the world, you know, the world of college and the world of work, there were rules. Rules about what time to get there and what time to leave and what time to do this and what time to do that. And then we had children. Suzanne and I only had one son, so we didn't have to deal with this. But those of you that have had more than one child, you know that the older sibling, the teenager, has rules with regards to what the younger sibling can do. The younger sibling cannot tell anyone out in public that they're kin to them. The younger one cannot admit not only that they don't know them, but at home there are certain rules. And the rules are this: don't look at me, don't touch me, don't like me, don't do anything, don't come into my room. That's the rules. Right? We live in rules. We live in a world, in a society of rules. Well, then we think, eventually we think as we grow up, we're going to get out of those rules. We're going to get away from those rules, and the reality of it is we don't. We don't get away from those rules. Those rules are a part of life, wherever we go. But then if you want to morph that just a little bit and change that a little bit, wherever you go, there are laws. You drove here tonight, and you drove, hopefully, at least speed limit. Speed limit in Nashville, I live what's considered West Nashville. Speed limit in Nashville is as fast as you can go. That's the speed limit. But we understand that there are laws with regards to speed. There are laws that are made by our elected officials for our good, supposedly, and for our safety and for our well-being. I don't always agree with those laws, and I'm sure you don't either. I don't always see eye to eye with those elected officials. Matter of fact, if you listen now, if you listen to either the Democratic Party or you listen to the Republican Party, here's what they're telling you. If that other guy wins, your freedoms are gone. That's what they're telling you right now, both sides. So, we might as well stay home and not vote. No, that's not true either. We understand, though, that government, that God has told us to be subject to the higher powers that be, Romans 13, verse 1. We may not always agree. We may not always like it, but one of the things that we know is that each year there seems to be, if you will, a tightening of the screws so that those rules, those laws are changing. And what the church could once do, sometimes it cannot do. And while, for the most part, churches in Middle Tennessee are still allowed to preach every bit of the truth the way it is, we read about in other places where the government is saying you can't do that, or you can't say this, or you can't turn that down, or you can't put those folks from the standpoint of telling them that they're wrong. And we have to ask ourselves, what do we as Christians do? Where do we stand? How can we get past that? How can we live in this world and have a government that's telling us with regards to our faith that sometimes you can't practice it? Well, I want us to spend time tonight, and if you have your Bibles with you, you might want to turn to the book of Daniel. I think Daniel answers this question in kind of a strange way. Now, here's what we know with regards to Daniel. When I mentioned the name Daniel, probably the first thing that came into your mind was Daniel and the lion's den, and we'll get there. I still remember as a child going to Bible school, loved Bible school. I still remember the old flannel graphs. You see, that's how far back I go. But the old flannel graph teachings, I still remember those, of Daniel and the lion's den. And I always remember singing in VBS, and I'll spare you singing because I can't do it. But I remember singing about Daniel in the lion's den. But there's a lot more to Daniel than the lion's den. And there's a lot to Daniel with regards to government. And you say, well, wait a minute. If I recall in my studies, in my reading of Daniel, one thing that I understand was that Daniel was a good guy, that the government liked him. That while Daniel was taken away in Babylonian captivity and lived in the land of the Chaldeans, and that while it was 70 years, his ministry, if you will allow me to call it that, was in length of 70 years, and he was transported there when he was 17. And we believe, not for sure, because we don't have biblical proof, but we believe that Daniel lived there even to the point that he died. But he was under more than one king. He was under Nebuchadnezzar and he was under Darius. He was seen as a good guy. They liked him. But yet, think about the Chaldeans. Think about the Babylonians that he lived under. They were polytheistic. Many gods. They didn't have just one. They were sort of like, if you will, those on Mars Hill in the book of Acts. Many gods. They had a god for everything. If there was a thing, it had a god. They were trying to influence Daniel. And yet, in a very positive way, Daniel stood the test. How did he do that? That's where we're going and how we're going to go at it this evening. How in the world did Daniel prove to be a good guy? Well, number one, he lived a purposed life. I want you to think about that for a minute. Matter of fact, if you're there in Daniel, if you look in verse 8 of the first chapter, it says that Daniel purposed in his heart. That's a great thought. Now let's back up. Let's back up a few verses before that and understand the story. Here's the story. The story was that Nebuchadnezzar had gotten if you will, the head of the eunuchs to find certain ones, certain men that were good looking, knowledgeable, that could represent the kingdom well, and let them for 3 years be taught. Be taught in the ways of the Chaldeans, but also not only to be taught, not only to learn their wisdom, but also they would be, if you will, wined and dined. They would have the wine of the king, and they would have the delicacies of the king. And Daniel didn't like that. He didn't want that. We're introduced then to 3 individuals besides Daniel. We commonly know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These individuals say, tell you what, let us just eat the pulps, let us just eat vegetables. I don't guess I would qualify because I like meat with my meals, but nevertheless, let us just eat our food and let's see how we fare. Oh no, Ashpenaz says you can't do that. No, king will be furious. No, that won't happen. No. And Daniel says, just let us do it for 10 days and see how we fare. And so they allowed it. And sure enough, these 4 individuals came out smelling like a rose. They were better than the king's men who had all of the delicacies. But verse 8 says that Daniel purposed in his heart. He lived a purposed life. He lived a life of direction. He lived a life that knew where he was going. He knew where he was headed. He knew how he wanted to get there. I had an individual several years ago tell me that they were fixing to go on vacation. And I said, wonderful. I said, where are you going? We don't know. I said, huh? We don't know. And that's not my nature. That's not the way I act or I am. I'm very directional. And I said, you don't know where you're going? And they said, no. And I said, when are you leaving? Well, in the morning, first thing. But you don't know where you're going? No. I said, so I have a question for you. And they said, okay, what's the question? I said, when you get to the end of the driveway in the morning, how do you know which way you're going to turn? Oh, well, I guess we kind of do sort of know where we're going. Life's like that, right? We're headed in a direction. Paul talked about in Philippians 3, forgetting those things that are behind, reaching forward to those things that are before. I press towards the mark. When you think about the Christian life, you think about living a life that's moving forward. We're always reminded in the Bible, don't look back. Don't think about the past. Get over the past. Get past the past. Move beyond. Move forward. How do we do that? Purposed life. Daniel purposed his life. Now, where was Daniel's purpose? Well, it was in heaven. He realized that he did not want to defile himself with the king's meat. He wanted to stay with God. He was a man of God. Matter of fact, in Daniel chapter 2, verse 28, when Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and none of the individuals of that day, the astrologers, the individuals that claimed they could interpret dreams, the wizards, the magicians, none of them could give the meaning of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had because it had been revealed to them. And part of Nebuchadnezzar's, if you will, I think, intelligence was not to tell these guys the dream and say, give me the interpretation. They had to give the dream and the interpretation. Daniel says, as he begins talking to Nebuchadnezzar about the dream and the interpretation, makes the claim in verse 28 of Daniel 2. There is a God in heaven. How did he know that? Because he believed God. He trusted in God. He had come to understand who God was, but it was all because of that purposed life, that direction that he was going to go, that direction that he understood. And we would call it the same with regards to us and the Bible, that God has given us a direction. God has told us how to live our life. He's told us in Colossians chapter 3, in verse 1, that we're to set our affections on things above. When you set your affections on things above, you've purposed your life to say, here's where I'm going, here's where I'm headed, here's where I'm going to be. That's how Daniel lived his life. Daniel was seen as a good guy. Daniel wore, if you will, in the old cowboy movies, Daniel wore the white hat. Kings loved him. Government loved him. But I believe in part they loved him because he lived a purposed life. He lived a directional life. He understood what was important in life. And so in that purpose, he set his heart, he set his mind, he set his life to knowing a God. That is, Paul would say, even for us, in the book of Colossians chapter 1 and verse 13, who's delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of his love, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. For us, that's where we're headed. How do we get along when government doesn't say, hey, we don't want you to teach this? I think the first thing we have to understand is we have to live a purposed life. We have to understand where we're headed, why we're headed there, and how we're going to get there through Jesus Christ. You might say, well, that won't change government. I understand that. But it will change us. and it will change those around us. It will affect them. For a period of a year, almost a year, I worked in an industry. I was in between preaching jobs, and I worked in industry. And I don't say this to toot my own horn, but there was a lady that was considered one of my techs. I had 2 techs that worked very closely, and really, this lady was an individual that, as she said, I don't go to church. I believe in God, but I don't go to church and don't want anything to do with church. She was on her 4th husband, and there was a lot of things about her. And when you got her mad, I tried to go to the other side of the building not to get scorched. It was that kind of thing. She said, when I left, here's what she said: I never thought I'd ever be friends with a preacher. I know that was a compliment. I'm still trying to figure it out 4 years later, 5 years later, but that was a compliment. Dear friends, we make a difference, but we have to understand that we have to live a purposed life. But what's the second thing about Daniel that we learn that helps us with regards to the situation at hand? Daniel lives, secondly, a life of perseverance. He stuck with it. One of the things that and I encourage you to read the book of Daniel. It's a short book. It doesn't take long to read. And yes, there's a lot of visions and dreams, and sometimes we get all kind of confused in all of those things, and that's very understandable. But one of the things you find out is that David stuck with being a man of God in a world that was not prone to following God. As we said, Babylonians were polytheistic. They had a lot of gods. And yet Daniel stayed with what he knew. He didn't give it up. He didn't stop. When he proclaimed to Nebuchadnezzar, as we said in chapter 2, there is a God, he didn't back down from that. He didn't back down and say, well, maybe, possibly, there could be, there might be, I'm just not sure. No, he stayed with that. And he stayed with it throughout the book of Daniel. He stayed with it throughout his life. A faithful child of God in the midst of a society, in the midst of a government, in the midst of a king that did not want God as their faith. He persevered. When we look at us and our life and the times and difficulties that arise, we have to understand that we need to persevere. The Bible tells us time and time again, Paul would write to Timothy and he would remind him to hold fast to the things that I've taught you. We might paraphrase 2 Timothy chapter 3. He would also tell Timothy himself in 2 Timothy chapter 1 to stand in the truths that I've taught you. He would tell the church, he being Paul, would tell the church at Thessalonica to hold fast the traditions that you've been taught in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 15. He would pray for the church at Colossae that they would walk worthy of the things that they've been called. That they would stay true to God and to His Word. There was no backing down. There was no possibly, give in or fudge if you want to. Understand there's gray areas. Understand that there's times in which, you can give in. You can compromise. No. Paul said, stand up, stand true, stand faithful. There are times in our life in which we'll be tested. There are times in our life in which we will literally be put to the test. And we have to ask ourselves, will we stay true or will we give in? In Numbers, the 13th chapter, in Numbers, the 14th chapter, there are 12 spies that are sent out into the land of Canaan. There are 12 spies. that find out exactly what the land is about. You see, children of Israel are needing to go into the land, to take the land, and they're wanting to see what's there. And so there are spies that are sent, one from each tribe, and as they're sent, they come back. And remember, that's where they had the giant fruit where literally put a rod in between the cluster of grapes, and it took more than one man to carry it. And they came back and they said, man, we are grasshoppers in the land of giants. We can't do it. We can't do it. But there are two that come back. And here's their answer. With the Lord's help, we can overtake these people. Now, it's very possible that these were giants. Historians tell us that it's very possible that these were men that may have been some 9.5 feet tall, that not only were they tall men, but that this land was lush and flush and that it was great. And yet these two, Joshua and Caleb, says, hey, we can do it with the help of God. And we ask, how in the world? And the answer is they believed God and they were willing to stick with Him, even when it looked like they couldn't. Noah would be another one that stuck with God when he couldn't find but only his family to save, him and his animals, if you will, the animals that he saved on the ark. There are times in which we want to give in. There are times in which we want to stop. It was 1952. Florence Chadwick was her name. Florence Chadwick was known far and wide in the 50s for being a distance swimmer. She was a world champion, but she was an individual that set records. And in 1952, she was going to swim from Catalina Island to California. It had never been done before by a woman, and she was going to be the first. She got into the icy cold water one morning, and it was foggy. You couldn't hardly see in front of where you were. And she swam for several hours. The water was cold. There were sharks all around. And finally, not far from shore, actually, she gave in. They asked her, those that were with her, asked her, do you want to quit? And she said yes, and she got into a boat to realize that she was almost to the shore. Reporters asked her, they said, how does it feel? Well, it feels awful. I've been training for this for a long time. I've been looking forward to this and thought I was going to do it. Well, what happened? She said, the problem was if I could have just seen land, but I couldn't see it for the fog. And if I could have just seen land, I would have made it. But I didn't. I didn't stay with it long enough. Daniel, in a time in which government was pushing in on him, persevered. And he lived a life of perseverance. But then thirdly, Daniel lived a life of personal purity. Now when we read there in Daniel chapter 1, we find out that, as we said a while ago, that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat. It is not the fact that meat would make him impure, if you will, but it was the fact that this was something that was above and beyond and in excess of what he was used to and what he wanted to do. His life, though, of personal purity might be found better in the 6th chapter. That's the story of the lion's den. It's there in the first few verses where Daniel finds out something. What he finds out is that really he's a good guy. The satraps, which were also what we would consider governors of areas, the governors got together and they decided that for 30 days no one could worship anyone but Darius. No one could worship anyone but Darius. And so, Daniel went up into his chambers and he prayed as was his custom. It's not that he prayed, but here's what I want you to catch. Why was the law all of a sudden passed? Because those governors and those satraps that had gotten together, they said they didn't like Daniel. They wanted to put him to death. They wanted to somehow to kill him, to ostracize him, to get him out of government. He was the goody two shoes, they felt. And so, what did they do? Well, the only way we're going to get him is if we get him with regards to his religion. We're not going to get him any other way. We're not going to get him out of here. We're not going to get him put in prison. We're not going to get him put to death. We're not going to get him out of the favor of the king unless we do something about his religion. And so they did. Now think about that. Here's a man that lives life and it's so good in its personal purity that the only way that they could get to him was to get to his faith. We as Christians have been called to be pure. You know, Paul would remind Timothy to keep yourself pure, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 22. He would also remind Timothy that he was to be an example of the believers in word, in spirit, in love, and purity, according to 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12. That he was to be an example of a pure life. Now it's interesting because the psalmist in Psalm 29, verse 3, asks a simple question. Who's going to ascend into the Lord's hill? Here's another way of asking that question. Who's going to make it to heaven? He that it begins, he that has clean hands and a pure heart. That's challenging, isn't it? To think about that we need purity in our lives as well. Our speech needs to be pure. Our actions need to be unadulterated. Our walk needs to be with the Lord. To be hand in hand. We need to shine as bright lights before the world. We need to be individuals that truly do lead that pure life. Peter would remind us in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, that having your life, your conversation, your conduct honorable before the Gentiles. Now just think about that. Think about Peter. Think about the time which he's writing. He's writing in a time of persecution. He's writing to Christians that are being persecuted. And here's what he's telling them. You live a good life. You live a life in front of everybody. Notice what he says. He says the Gentiles. The word Gentiles. There's 2 or 3 different ways of looking and translating that phrase there. It's the hoi lopoi, or it's the nations, the ta ethnos. It's the idea of the people. Because you were Jew in that sense of the word, or you were a Gentile. You were everybody else. Everybody else was Gentiles to the Jews. And Peter says, before the world, you live honorably. You live in such a state, in such a way that he says that your conduct is honorable before the people. He says that as you do such, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works which they shall behold, glorify your Father. Now, that goes with a verse that we're very familiar with, right? Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. That's the life that Daniel lived before a government that wanted to change his thinking. He led a life of purity. He led a life while he made mistakes. He messed up. And we can all say, we make mistakes, we mess up. When push came to shove, what was Daniel doing and how did he live his life? With great purity. But then Daniel also was a positive influence. Yeah, when you read this book of Daniel, you come away with the fact that he really was. And Daniel, the 6th chapter, where we were just a second ago, Daniel, remember, opened up his windows, prayed to God. They threw him in a lion's den. Well, you can imagine a lion's den. I mean, you go to the zoo, you want all kinds of protection between you and the lions. Here they're throwing him into the lion's den. And it disturbs Darius. Yes, he fulfilled the law. He had been, if you will, hoodwinked into saying that it was a law that could not be changed. It was a law that the folks had set up that says it was for the Medes and the Persians. You know what this means? It just simply means you can't change it. I mean, it's written in stone. You see, they really tricked Darius so that they could get to Daniel. And so, when Darius had him thrown in the lion's den, it disturbed him. And when he came back, he cried out for Daniel. And Daniel was there alive and well. My God has been with me. He's protected me. And you read Daniel 6, guess what? Darius is a changed man. You read Daniel, the 4th chapter, and Nebuchadnezzar, who was the first king that Daniel was served under. And it's interesting because when you read Daniel chapter 4 and Nebuchadnezzar's speech of everything that went on, and he talks about, beginning about verse 33, he talks about basically, I like to paraphrase it this way. He talked about how God got his attention. And he was a changed man. He evidently repented. And it seems, at least to me, as if it was a true repentance. Where did all that come from? It came from a man who lived a life like he was supposed to live it. He was a man that ultimately was a positive influence upon those upon whom he came in contact. We all have influences. No man lives to himself, Paul said in Romans 14 and verse 7, and no man dies to himself. We all are individuals that have an impact upon someone and something else. Jesus was crucified. Jesus had come forth out of the grave. John 21. We don't see Jesus, but we see Peter and we see the apostles. And they asked Peter, they said, what do we do next? Because you see, there's this, they just didn't know what to do. And so Peter says, I'm going fishing. The rest of them said, we go too. The influence that Peter had on the other apostles to remain calm in a situation reminds us of the influence that we must portray in our Christian life. Knowing that the Lord's coming, knowing that we can anticipate that day and we can look anxiously for it. With great hope we live, with great assurance it's ours. Daniel made an impact upon the lives that he touched, just like Peter, just like, if you will, Paul. Story is told of Calvin Coolidge, 30th President of the United States. He was from a small, if you will, small little community in Massachusetts. He invited townspeople to come to the White House for a visit. And so it was a thing amongst the community. Oh man, this is great, this is great. And so they said, wait a minute. Before they left town to go to the White House, Have anybody been to the White House? No, nobody had been. How do we act? We don't know. Tell you what, we'll do whatever Calvin does. See, they thought enough of him. They were friends enough with him. They called him, we'll do whatever Calvin does. Okay, that's a great idea. And so they watched, and every little thing Calvin did, Coolidge did, they did. And so one time he took the saucer out from his cup, and he poured some in the saucer. And guess what? Everybody else pulled their saucer out, poured a little bit in their saucer. But then Coolidge bent over and put it on the floor and said, "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty. Be careful who you follow." Daniel lived a positive life, a positive influence. In a government that sometimes will tell us, no, how do we act? We act like Daniel. But then there's one last thing. How did Daniel do all this? Go back to Daniel 6, verse 10, before he was thrown in the lion's den. When the decree was made, verse 10 says that Daniel, knowing that the decree was made, went up to the tower, opened up his windows towards Jerusalem, and knelt. He didn't hide it. He went into the tower, knelt down, opened up the windows towards Jerusalem, and prayed to God. Dear friends, how are we going to live in a society sometimes that doesn't want us to be Christians? How are we going to live when a government sometimes oppresses us for what we believe and why we believe it and how we believe it? Get down on our knees and pray to God. Ask, and it shall be given to you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened to you. Everyone that asks, receives. John, that's Matthew 7. John said in 1 John chapter 5, this is the confidence that we have of him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And according to Malachi chapter 3, God says, pray to me and I'll open up the windows of heaven and pour out blessings, and you'll not have storehouses in which to receive them. I believe in God. You believe in God. You wouldn't be here on Wednesday night. Sometimes we can't let the fear of the outside world push in on us and say, you've got to change. We need the courage of Daniel, that stood and was willing to stand, even against kings and against those that were in authority. But how did he do it? Did he go out and perform a riot? Did he go out and get a lynch mob? Did he go out and cause a revolt? Nope. He lived his life as God wanted him to live it, to the best of his ability. And I believe that's how we change the world. By being Daniels that live in a world that sometimes doesn't like us and sometimes pushes in. But it takes the courage of Daniel. Origen was a 3rd century theologian. And Origen rose up and proclaimed his faith in God. And when he did, he was thrown into prison. His son, 16 years old, wanted to follow Dad, believed the same things as Dad, wanted to follow Dad. And his mother did not want him to go. He was willing to, I want to go to jail just like Dad because I believe. And his mother didn't want him to. And so she took all of his clothes and she hid them and would not tell them. The young boy was not afraid to go to prison, but he was afraid to go outside naked, and so he stayed at home and didn't revolt. Well, I don't know that we need the courage to go outside naked, but I do think we need the courage of Daniel. Let's begin where he lived his life. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day. We're thankful for the opportunity that we had to study your word this evening, for these good people, for their attention, for their love for you to be here this evening. And we're thankful for the fact that this good congregation stands, and it stands in such a way as to love you and to live for you. Help us to each day, that despite how the world lives, despite how the world does, that we will love you and cherish you in that relationship, and that we'll live for you each day with courage, with conviction, with vim and vigor and vitality, that we'll show the world through our life who is God. We ask now that you be with us as we separate, as we go to our places of abode, that we will have safe journeys and that all things will be well when we arrive. Watch over us, bless us, keep us, and hold us as we hold to you, for this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. God bless you all. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank the elders for allowing me to come.